camp of the Persian army sprawled across the plain like a great beast, its heart throbbing with the anticipation of war. Tents lined in precise rows, the gleam of armor under the cold moonlight, and the low murmur of voices filled the air. The soldiers were tense, each man aware of the significance of the moment. This was the 5th time they had prepared to march on Babylon, and this time, Cyrus the Great had promised them victory. The king had called upon every resource, every strategy, and every ally he could muster. The dark forces that had once whispered in the recesses of his mind now roared with power, their influence woven into every aspect of his plan. He had made pacts with entities that had no place in the light of day, had bartered with shadows and secrets in exchange for strength, and yet, the power they had granted him had not been enough to defeat the one who stood as the guardian of Babylon. Ira, the name alone was enough to set Cyrus's teeth on edge. This mysterious protector, who wielded powers that defied reason, had become the bane of his existence. Each time Cyrus had led his army to the gates of Babylon, Ira had been there to meet him, turning back the tide of conquest with a cold, unyielding force. Each time, Cyrus had been forced to retreat, his dreams of victory slipping further from his grasp. But not this time. This time, he would crush Ira. He would see Babylon fall, and the Persian Empire would expand once more, reclaiming its place as the greatest power the world had ever known. He had prepared everything meticulously, leaving nothing to chance. The forces of darkness that he had summoned whispered promises of success, filling his mind with visions of Babylon in flames, of Ira broken and defeated at his feet. Cyrus stood in his tent, staring at the map spread before him. The flickering light of the oil lamps cast shifting shadows over the parchment, making the borders of Babylon seem to pulse with a life of their own. His generals surrounded him, Mazars, Gobrias, Arbaces, and Megabyzus, each one a seasoned warrior, each one loyal to their king. They watched Cyrus intently, waiting for the final word, the order to march. But as he opened his mouth to speak, to give the command that would set the wheels of war in motion, a sudden, searing pain exploded behind his eyes. Cyrus staggered, his vision darkening as the world tilted and spun around him. He clutched at the edge of the table, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought to remain upright. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a white-hot lance that seemed to pierce his very soul. The voices, the dark whispers that had guided him, that had promised him victory, suddenly grew louder, more insistent, their tone shifting from seductive to demanding. They clawed at his mind, pulling him down into a maelstrom of agony and confusion. His thoughts fragmented, splintering into 1,000 shards of fear and doubt. "Your Majesty!" Mazars' voice cut through the chaos, sharp with alarm. He rushed to Cyrus's side, catching the king just as his legs buckled beneath him. "Hold on!" Cyrus's world was a blur of sound and movement, the edges of his vision going black as the pain surged again, this time accompanied by a wave of nausea. He could feel the bile rising in his throat, his body betraying him as he fought to maintain control. He tried to speak, to issue an order, but the words tangled in his throat, lost in the storm that raged within him. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the terrified faces of his generals, their confidence shattered by the sight of their king brought low by an unseen force. A desperate realization. Cyrus awoke to the sensation of cold water being splashed on his face. He gasped, his eyes flying open as his body convulsed with the shock of it. He was no longer in his tent, but in the dim confines of his private chamber within the palace. The walls, draped with rich tapestries, seemed to close in around him, the heavy fabric blocking out the light and sound of the world beyond. For a moment, he lay there, disoriented, the events of the previous hours, or had it been days? A jumbled mess in his mind. But then the memory of the pain, the blinding, searing pain, came rushing back, and with it, the realization that something was terribly wrong. He struggled to sit up, his muscles protesting the movement. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and his vision wavered, the room swimming before his eyes. He felt weak, drained, as if the very life had been sucked out of him. father." The voice, low and filled with concern, drew his attention to the figure seated beside his bed. Cambyses II, his eldest son, sat there, his expression a mixture of worry and confusion. The young man's brow was furrowed, his eyes searching his father's face for some sign of reassurance. Cambyses, Cyrus's voice was hoarse, a mere shadow of its former strength. He reached out, gripping his son's hand, finding solace in the warmth of the touch. "Father, what happened?" Cambyses asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "You collapsed. The generals brought you here. They're all waiting. But you..." Cyrus closed his eyes, willing the room to stop spinning. He had no answers for his son, no explanation for the sudden, debilitating attack that had felled him. All he knew was that the dark forces he had sought to control had turned against him, punishing him for his hubris, for daring to believe that he could harness powers beyond mortal comprehension. The voices had lied. They had promised him victory, had filled his mind with visions of conquest. But now he saw the truth. The darkness he had courted was not an ally. It was a predator, waiting for the moment to strike, to sink its claws into him and tear him apart from within. A cold dread settled over Cyrus, heavier than the ache in his bones. He had unleashed something far more powerful than he had realized, and now it was coming for him. "Listen to me, Cambyses," Cyrus said, his voice trembling with the weight of what he was about to say. You must not go to Babylon. Not while Ira is alive." Cambyses frowned, clearly taken aback by his father's words. "But father, we've prepared for this. The army is ready. You've always told me that Babylon must fall, that it's our destiny." "I was wrong." Cyrus's voice was sharp, cutting off his son's protest. The effort to speak so forcefully left him gasping for breath, but he pressed on, desperate to make Cambyses understand. "Ira is not like us. He is not mortal. He is divine." Cambyses stared at his father, shock and disbelief warring on his features. The idea that Ira, the man who had thwarted them time and again, was something more than human was too much for him to process. But how? Cyrus squeezed his son's hand, drawing him closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I sought to defeat him with the darkness, with powers that no man should wield. But it was not enough. The darkness, it cannot touch him. It cannot defeat him." Cambyses shook his head, trying to understand, but the words made no sense to him. His father, the man he had always seen as invincible, now seemed to be unraveling before his eyes, speaking of things that defied reason. "Then what are we to do?" Cambyses asked, his voice small, almost childlike in its desperation. Cyrus closed his eyes, a deep weariness settling over him. He had no answers, no solutions. All he knew was that the darkness was now a part of him, and it would destroy him if he did not find a way to resist it. The passing of the king. The day dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with the weight of impending loss. The air in the royal palace of Persepolis was thick with an unspoken sorrow, a sense of inevitability that settled over the inhabitants like a shroud. The once vibrant halls were quiet, save for the hushed whispers of the servants and the occasional creak of the ancient stone walls. In the heart of the palace, in a chamber dimly lit by the flickering light of oil lamps, Cyrus the Great lay on his deathbed, his once mighty form now frail and weakened by the ravages of time and illness. For hours, he had lingered on the edge of consciousness, his breaths coming in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against the encroaching darkness. The pain that had racked his body had subsided, leaving behind a deep weariness that seeped into his very bones. The man who had conquered empires, who had carved his name into the annals of history, now lay surrounded by his closest advisors, his generals, and his family, the weight of his years pressing down on him like a leaden cloak. At his side stood Cambyses II, his son and heir, the man who would soon bear the full weight of the Persian Empire upon his shoulders. The young prince's face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from hours of sleepless vigil. He had watched his father's decline with a growing sense of helplessness, unable to do anything but bear witness to the inevitable. And now, as he looked down at the man who had shaped his life, who had taught him everything he knew. Cambyses felt the stirrings of a grief so profound that it threatened to consume him. Cyrus's eyes fluttered open, the once piercing gaze now dimmed by the approach of death. He looked up at Cambyses, his expression softened by a rare tenderness, a love that he had seldom shown in life, but which now shone through in his final moments. Cambyses, Cyrus rasped, his voice weak, barely audible over the crackle of the fire in the hearth. He reached out, his hand trembling as it sought his son's. Cambyses immediately grasped his father's hand, feeling the coolness of his skin, the fragility of the life that still clung to him. "Father," Cambyses whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am here." Cyrus managed a faint smile, his grip tightening ever so slightly. You must be strong, my son. The Empire, it is yours now. You must protect it, guide it, as I have done." Cambyses nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He had always known that this day would come, that he would one day succeed his father as king. But he had never imagined it would come so soon, or that it would be under such circumstances. The burden of the empire, the legacy of Cyrus the Great, now rested on his shoulders, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear. "Listen to me," Cyrus continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. Do not seek to conquer Babylon. Ira is not of this world. He cannot be defeated by mortal means." Cambyses frowned, his heart aching at the sight of his father struggling to speak. "But father, you promise me," Cyrus interrupted, his tone suddenly fierce, a flash of the old king's fire igniting in his eyes. "Promise me that you will not march on Babylon, not while Ira still lives." Cambyses hesitated, the weight of the promise pressing down on him like a vice. He had always dreamed of conquest, of expanding the empire even further than his father had done. But now, seeing the desperation in his father's eyes, he knew that he could not refuse. "I promise, father," Cambyses said quietly, his voice trembling. "I will not seek to conquer Babylon." Cyrus closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping his lips as if a great burden had been lifted from his soul. He lay still for a moment, his breath slowing, his grip on Cambyses' hand loosening. "Good," Cyrus murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Good, my son. You will be a great king. Led with wisdom, lead with strength. The empire will endure." Cambyses felt tears welling in his eyes, but he blinked them away, determined to remain strong for his father. He held his father's hand, feeling the life slowly ebbing away, the once mighty king now reduced to a frail, fading shadow of his former self. Cyrus's breaths grew fainter, each one a struggle, until finally, with one last exhale, he was still. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of the wind outside. Cyrus the Great, the man who had built an empire, who had conquered the known world, was gone. The legacy of Cyrus the Great. The news of Cyrus's death spread quickly throughout the palace, and soon, the entire city of Persepolis was shrouded in mourning. The streets were filled with the sounds of weeping and lamentation, the people of Persia grieving the loss of the man who had led them to greatness. For decades, Cyrus had been more than just a king. He had been a symbol of strength, of power, of the indomitable will of the Persian people. And now, he was gone, leaving behind a void that could never truly be filled. But even in death, Cyrus's legacy endured. He had left behind an empire that spanned from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Indus River in the east, a vast and diverse realm that had been united under his rule. He had established a system of governance that allowed for the peaceful coexistence of the many cultures and peoples within his empire, a system that would serve as a model for empires to come. Cyrus had also been a man of vision, a man who understood that true power lay not in the sword, but in the minds and hearts of the people. He had respected the customs and religions of the lands he had conquered, had allowed his subjects to maintain their own ways of life, and in doing so, had earned their loyalty and respect. It was said that no king before him had ever ruled with such wisdom, such compassion. And then there was the legacy of his conquests, the cities he had founded, the roads he had built, the trade routes he had established. Under his rule, the Persian Empire had become the center of the known world, a place where knowledge, culture, and commerce flourished. His name would be remembered for centuries to come, not just as a conqueror, but as a builder, a leader who had shaped the course of history. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the lesson he had passed on to his son in his final moments. The understanding that not all battles were meant to be fought, that there were some forces in the world that could not be overcome by sheer will or power. It was a lesson that Cambyses would carry with him for the rest of his life, a lesson that would guide him as he took on the mantle of kingship. The mourning of a nation. Cyrus's funeral was a grand affair, befitting a man of his stature. The entire empire came together to honor the memory of their fallen king, to pay their respects to the man who had shaped their world. The streets of Persepolis were lined with mourners, their faces etched with grief as they watched the funeral procession make its way through the city. The body of Cyrus the Great, draped in the finest silks and adorned with the symbols of his conquests, was carried on a gilded bier, flanked by his most trusted generals and advisors. Behind them walked Cambyses, now king, his expression solemn as he led the procession to the tomb of Cyrus, a magnificent structure carved into the mountainside, a fitting resting place for the man who had built an empire. As the procession reached the tomb, a hush fell over the crowd. The mourners watched in silence as Cyrus's body was laid to rest, surrounded by the treasures and symbols of his reign. The tomb was sealed, the final stones put in place, and with that, the era of Cyrus the Great came to an end. But even as the tomb was sealed, the legacy of Cyrus lived on, in the empire he had built, in the people he had led, and in the son who now bore the weight of the crown. Cambyses stood at the entrance to the tomb, his heart heavy with the weight of his new responsibilities. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that the challenges he would face would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. But he also knew that his father's wisdom, his strength, and his legacy would guide him, as surely as the sun rose and set each day. The reign of Cambyses II. With the death of Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II ascended to the throne, becoming the ruler of the vast Persian Empire. The transition of power was smooth, the loyalty of the empire's subjects unwavering, a testament to the strength of the foundation that Cyrus had built. Cambyses, though still grieving the loss of his father, took up the mantle of kingship with determination, fully aware of the enormous responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. Cambyses was a different man than his father, more reserved, more introspective. Where Cyrus had been a warrior king, leading his armies into battle, Cambyses was a ruler who preferred to lead from the throne, to govern with a steady hand rather than a sword. He had learned much from his father, had been shaped by Cyrus's teachings and by the legacy that had been left to him. And now, as king, he sought to honor that legacy, to rule with the same wisdom and strength that had defined Cyrus's reign. One of the first decisions Cambyses made as king was to honor the promise he had made to his father. He would not seek to conquer Babylon, not while Ira still lived. The specter of Ira loomed large in Cambyses's mind, a reminder of the limits of power, of the dangers of hubris. Cyrus had warned him that Ira was no mere mortal, that he was a force beyond comprehension, a guardian of Babylon who could not be defeated by conventional means. And so, Cambyses chose a different path, one that did not lead to war and destruction. Instead, Cambyses focused on consolidating the empire, on strengthening the bonds that held it together. He implemented reforms that improved the administration of the vast territories under his control, ensuring that the empire's diverse peoples were governed fairly and justly. He invested in infrastructure, building roads and bridges that connected the farthest reaches of the empire, facilitating trade and communication. He also continued his father's policy of religious tolerance, allowing the various cultures within the empire to practice their beliefs without interference. But Cambyses was not content to rest on the laurels of his father's achievements. He sought to expand the empire in other directions, turning his gaze toward Egypt, a land of wealth and ancient power. The conquest of Egypt became his primary focus, and under his leadership, the Persian army launched a successful campaign that brought the land of the pharaohs under Persian control. The victory solidified Cambyses's reputation as a capable and ambitious ruler, one who could expand the empire's borders without compromising its stability. Yet even as Cambyses pursued his own conquests, he never forgot the lesson his father had taught him. He understood that power had its limits, that there were forces in the world that could not be tamed or controlled. And so, he ruled with a sense of caution, always mindful of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, always aware that the empire he governed was a fragile thing, one that could be shattered by hubris or recklessness. The legacy endures. As the years passed, Cambyses too continued to rule the Persian Empire with a steady hand. He faced challenges and setbacks, as all rulers do, but he met them with the wisdom and strength that had been instilled in him by his father. The empire thrived under his leadership, its borders secure, its people prosperous. And though Cambyses was a different king than Cyrus had been, his reign was marked by the same qualities that had defined his father's: a commitment to justice, respect for the diversity of his subjects, and a determination to protect and preserve the empire that had been entrusted to him. Cyrus the Great's legacy endured, not just in the lands he had conquered or the cities he had built, but in the lessons he had passed on to his son. Cambyses ruled with the knowledge that true power lay not in conquest, but in the ability to lead with wisdom and compassion. He understood that the empire was more than just a collection of territories. It was a living, breathing entity, one that required careful stewardship and a deep understanding of the forces that shaped it. And so, the Persian Empire continued to flourish, its people living under the protection of a king who had learned from the greatest of teachers. The name of Cyrus the Great became a legend, his story passed down through the generations, a symbol of the heights that could be achieved through strength, wisdom, and a deep understanding of the world. Cambyses never sought to conquer Babylon, as he had promised his father. He knew that the city was protected by forces beyond his control, forces that had defeated even the great Cyrus. But he also knew that the empire did not need Babylon to be strong, that its strength lay in the unity of its people, in the wisdom of its rulers, and in the legacy of the man who had built it. In time, Cambyses' own name would be remembered alongside that of his father, a ruler who had carried the empire forward, who had honored the legacy of Cyrus the Great while forging his own path. And though the world would change, though empires would rise and fall, the lessons of Cyrus and Cambyses would endure, a reminder of the power of wisdom, the strength of leadership, and the enduring legacy of those who understand the true nature of power. And so, the Empire of Persia continued, a beacon of civilization in a world of chaos, its foundation strong, its future secure. The name of Cyrus the Great would echo through the ages, a symbol of what could be achieved through vision, strength, and an understanding of the forces that shaped the world. For in the end, it was not the conquest that defined Cyrus's legacy, but the wisdom he had passed on to his son, the understanding that true power lay not in the sword, but in the mind and the heart. And that legacy, more than any empire, would endure.